There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. And one of the most common questions I get when discussing the use of cold for sake of mental or physical performance, metabolism, etc., is how cold should it be? How cold should the water be? How cold should the environment be? 250% increases in dopamine that have been observed with cold water immersion. And all of that points to the fact that cold water immersion very likely increases testosterone. There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? What are some of these activities? Well, in recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. In part, this was popularized by Wim Hof, the so-called Iceman, getting into cold showers, taking ice baths, exposing oneself to cold water of various kinds, can in fact increase our levels of dopamine as well as the neuromodulator norepinephrine. This is not a new phenomenon. In the 1920s, a guy by the name of Vincent Prisnitz was one of the first people to popularize and formalize cold water therapies. He was an advocate of cold water exposure in order to boost the immune system and increase feelings of well-being. And actually, this practice dates back long before Vincent's popularized it. And Wim Hof is the more recent iteration of this. First of all, some of the safety parameters. Let's establish those first. Getting into very, very cold water, 30-degree Fahrenheit or even low 40-degree Fahrenheit, can put somebody into a state of cold water shock. I mean, people can die doing that. So obviously, you want to approach this with some caution. But for most people, getting into 60-degree water or 50-degree water, or if you're acclimated and comfortable with it, 40-degree water or 45-degree water can have tremendously beneficial results on your neuromodulator systems, including dopamine. What temperature of water you can tolerate will depend on how cold water adapted you are and how familiar you are with the experience of getting into cold water. And when I say comfortable with, I should mention there is never a case in which getting into cold water does not evoke a release of epinephrine. So the quickening of the breath, the widening of the eyes, the feeling as if you can't catch your breath, and even some physical pain at the level of the skin, that happens almost every time that you get into cold water, even if you're cold water adapted. What almost everybody knows and understands is that wall, as I like to refer to it, is coming. That's always the first experience of getting into cold water. There's no real way around that. Now, this study that I mentioned earlier, Human Physiological Responses to Immersion into Water of Different Temperatures. Really interesting study that was done and published in the the European Journal of Applied Physiology. I can provide a link to that study in the show caption. It's a really interesting study. They looked at people getting exposed to water that was warm, moderately cold, or very cold. It was 32 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, or 14 degrees Celsius. You can just put those online and do the conversion, or you can do the conversion to Fahrenheit if you like. But in any case, what they looked at were the concentrations of things like epinephrine and dopamine and so on. And what they found was really interesting. First of all, upon getting into cold water, the changes in adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, were immediate and fast, and these were huge increases. So that's the getting into the cold water that everybody experiences, these huge increases in adrenaline. But then what was interesting is they observed that dopamine levels started to rise somewhat slowly and then continued to rise and reach levels as high as 2.5 times above baseline. That's a remarkably high increase. Remember, if we go back to our examples of chocolate, sex, a doubling above baseline, nicotine, 2.5 times above baseline, cocaine, the increase in dopamine from cold water exposure of this kind was comparable to what one sees from cocaine, except in this case, it wasn't a rise and crash. it was actually a sustained rise in dopamine that took a very long time, up to 3 hours, to come back down to baseline, which is really remarkable. And I think this explains some of the positive mental and physical effects that people report subjectively after doing cold water exposure. And one of the most common questions I get when discussing the use of cold for sake of mental or physical performance, metabolism, etc., is how cold should it be? How cold should the water be? How cold should the environment be? And I just will tell you now, and I'm going to say this again and again throughout the episode because it will continue to be true throughout the episode and long after the episode is over. How cold depends on your cold tolerance, your core metabolism, and a number of other features that there is simply no way I could know or have access to. So I would like you to use this rule of thumb. If you are using deliberate cold exposure, the environment that you place yourself into should place your mind into a state of, whoa, I would really like to get out of this environment, but I can stay in safely. Okay, now that might seem a little bit arbitrary, but let's say you were to get into a warm shower and it would feel really, really nice, and you were to start turning down the warm and turning up the cold. There would be some threshold at which it would feel uncomfortable to you. And if you were to continue to make a little bit colder than that, you would really want to get out of the shower, but you were confident that you could stay in without risking your health, right? Without risking a heart attack. Now that's very different than jumping into a very, very cold lake, or, I've seen these images of people that will cut holes into, frozen over lakes, and they'll get into that cold water. If you are trained to do that and you have the right conditions, etc., that can be done reasonably safely, but that's certainly not what I would start with. And for many people, that will be too cold. And indeed, some people can go into cold shock and can die as a consequence of getting to that extremely cold water very quickly. Now, that's not to scare you away from deliberate cold exposure. It's just to say that there's no simple prescriptive of how cold to make the environment in order to extract maximum benefit for mental or physical performance. So the simple rule of thumb is going to be place yourself into an environment that is uncomfortably cold, but that you can stay in safely. Okay, and you'll have to experiment a bit. And that number, meaning that temperature, will vary from day to day. It will vary across the 24-hour cycle because of that endogenous, meaning that internal rhythm in temperature that I talked about earlier. Low early in the day, rises into the afternoon, drops at night. You can actually do this experiment if you like. Try getting into a cold shower at 11 o'clock at night, if you want, versus try doing it in the middle of the afternoon. It's quite a different experience. And by quite a different experience, I mean it requires quite a different degree of resilience and leaning into the practice. Your willpower will have to be higher, I suspect, late in the day as it compared to early in the day. But that will vary, of course, between individuals as well. But I can imagine two reasonably plausible mechanisms by which deliberate cold exposure to the groin, in particular the testicles, would increase testosterone. The first is somewhat direct, which is that anytime you cool a body surface, that if it's cold enough, you're going to get vasoconstriction. And then subsequently, you're going to get a rebound increase in vasodilation, meaning you're going to constrict the blood vessels in that area. And then after the cold is removed, there's going to be more blood flow to that area. And of course, blood flow relates to organ health and tissue health generally. So perfusion of that region and those and the gonads, to be specific, with additional blood, you could imagine in some ways increasing testosterone. That's reasonably plausible. The other probably more likely mechanism relates to dopamine increases caused by cold exposure that we talked about earlier. Again, anytime you have a somewhat stressful stimulus, but in particular with cold exposure, it seems that the catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine all increase. And dopamine is known to be in the pathway that can stimulate testosterone. And so while there isn't a direct relationship between dopamine stimulating testosterone, there is an interesting pathway whereby dopamine increases can trigger increases in things like luteinizing hormone, which can trigger increases in testosterone, as well as estrogen for that matter. So I know that there are a lot of people out there that are interested in the use of cold exposure for increasing testosterone, and some of those people and communities are indeed using cold exposure directly on the gonads, on the testes in order to do this. I'm not certain that direct contact is necessary. And in some cases, it might actually be quite dangerous, or you at least should be careful in terms of the tissues there and avoiding damage. But nonetheless, I think that a dopamine impact on testosterone is very likely, given the 250% increases in dopamine that have been observed with cold water immersion. And all of that points to the fact that cold water immersion very likely increases testosterone, but as a downstream consequence of the cold water immersion effects on dopamine and luteinizing hormone. And again, there's no reason to think that the increases in luteinizing hormone would also increase estrogen, probably not to dangerous or levels that one would want to avoid. But I don't think that there's anything particularly specific about cold for inducing testosterone and not other hormones. I think it's very likely it increases a number of different hormones. I do hope that there will be a systematic study on this in the not too distant future. I also hope to not be a subject in the cooling of the gonads experiment.